demonstrations have been hijacked by essentially anarchistic groups and professional agitators who are really in it just for the violence and the confrontation. And so I do make a distinction between legitimate, peaceful demonstrators and these violent agitators who are involved throughout the country.
Well, they took over an area in Seattle, and they're guarding it with guns. Mm-hmm. They tried to do it in Portland as well. Does the federal government have a responsibility to protect citizens of our country if the cities and states won't do it? Because people's property have been damaged. There are people who don't want this autonomous area in Seattle around their homes.
Right. Well, in the first instance, it's the responsibility, obviously, of the local officials and then the state officials to protect the rights of their citizens. At the end of the day, the federal government does have a responsibility to make sure that citizens are not deprived of their federal rights.
So will you challenge that autonomous city? Will you sue the mayor? What can you do?
Well, I don't want to get into specifics, but we're obviously keeping an eye on it. And as the president said, in due course, we may have to do something about it, but we can't let it go on indefinitely.
It's also sparked calls to defund the police. Ilhan Omar said that the Minneapolis Police Department is, quote, rotten to the root. What is the impact of this pushback on law enforcement? Are you worried about resignations, the cops walking off the job?
Yes, I mean, even before this happened, I was speaking out about how the job of being a policeman in the United States these days is the toughest job in the United States. They're under a lot of pressure, and I was concerned even before these pressures that we were having difficulty maintaining the levels of police we need in our cities, retaining them. And obviously this environment where they're demonized, will deter a lot of people from continuing to serve as police. And also I'm concerned of the effect that they may pull back some of their enforcement activities and not take those risks. So I think it could lead, as it's led in other situations, to an actual increase in violent crime and more deaths. I understand an event like Minneapolis and why it struck such a chord in the African American community. There has been longstanding distrust of law enforcement, and that partly comes out of the fact that for much of our history, our laws were explicitly discriminatory. And for the past few decades, we've been reforming our institutions to make sure they reflect our values, and the police have been engaged in that. And we shouldn't let this incident and the actions of a bad few obscure the fact that the police have made a lot of progress. Instances of the shooting of black unarmed males has been dropping. It was 38 5 years ago. Last year it was 10 in the nation. And 6 of those were involved in attacking the police officer at the time they were shot. So while any death is too many, the fact is that in proportion, it's relatively small. I mean, there are 8,000 roughly 8,000 homicides of African Americans in our country every year. 8,000. 10 last year were due to forced by the shooting an unarmed black male. So we have to keep that in perspective, and we also have to keep in perspective that the police forces are much more diverse. The leadership of the police is much more diverse. They are committed to reform. Community policing has been taking hold around the country. And that reform has to continue. And what we have to do is bring out of these episodes, Minneapolis, something that's good, and that is it'll galvanize the public will to continue that process of reform. But it has to be fair reform to the police.
Should the police have qualified immunity?
Yes, I think, generally in our history, immunity used to be absolute, and then they dropped it down to qualified to permit some lawsuits in egregious cases. But without qualified immunity, I think most people would not take the job as a police officer. So we would essentially be doing away with our police departments.
What are the implications of collective bargaining? There was an op-ed in the Journal talking about the police unions and how it's getting in the way of actual reform.
I think it largely depends on the unions, and it's hard to generalize. But I do think that police unions have an important role to play, and I do think that police management has to be able to get rid of bad apples, but by the same token, I think there has to be due process. One of the things that's always bothered, a Democratic senator once used the expression, I thought it was actually a good one, that being the Attorney General is like being the sheriff in one of these old Western movies. When the mob shows up at the jailhouse door, you're standing up in front of the jail. And sometimes that mob wants to hang the person, and sometimes they want to spring the person. And it's the job of the Attorney General not to be influenced by the mob, but try to do justice in that particular case. And I think police are at risk sometimes when some event like this happens, or we have to make special effort to make sure that they get due process. And the unions do play a role in that.
There is a lot of activity